But what we see here in our Parsha begins with, you are to appoint judges and officers for all your gates in the cities Adonai your God is giving you, tribe by tribe, and they're to judge the people with righteous judgment. Then we looked at our Haftorah portion in Isaiah 51. And you're going to hear God saying in verse 4, pay attention to me, my people, my nation, listen to me. For my Torah will go up from me, and I will calm them with my justice. You see, it's by justice in verse 20, verse 20, that we see in Deuteronomy chapter 16:20. It says, justice, only justice you must pursue. And that's what the judges of Israel are supposed to do. But we see here in Isaiah then that God himself will calm his people, those who observe the Torah, with his own justice. And he's saying that his righteousness is at hand, and a little bit more about that in a moment here, because my salvation goes out. Now in the Hebrew, God's salvation is the word Yeshua. It means God's salvation. That was the Hebrew name he was given. And you'll see that God's salvation is forever, as in verse 6. And then it says in verse number 8, closing, and my salvation for all generations. Well, what will this salvation be? Well, the salvation will be bringing justice. Verse 4, I will calm them with my justice. And then verse number 6 at the very end, and my justice will never end. And in verse number 8, my justice will be forever, and my salvation for all generations. And then what Jamie read, you're going to see where someone is put to death at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And then it goes ahead and says that there is going to come a time that God is going to go ahead and exact vengeance upon people. And that God is the one to whom the responsibility is given to exact that vengeance. And then it said that the Lord will judge his people. So you see the theme overall between the Torah, the Haftorah, which means the prophets here, and the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, has to do with justice. Now, who's the one that's going to ultimately be doing justice upon us and the nations? Well, it will be the Lord himself. So we see here that this Parsha is known as Parsha Shoftim. And we're going to go back to Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. You are to appoint Shoftim, that's judges, and officers for all your gates in the cities that the Lord your God is going to give you. We're going to go over the overview of all the Parsha first before I go in and start to take a magnifying glass and looking at specific things. First of all, in this Parsha we recognize, as we did over the last few weeks, that Moses is in the last 5 weeks of his life. He's in the last 5 weeks, and by the way, if you don't have a handout, you should have a handout. Any extra handouts, Phil? How many extra do you have? 2. Hey, anybody needing a handout? We got 2. And by the way, I'll let you in on a secret. Not every single frame that I have up here is on your handout. Ha-ha! It means you got to take notes. But the people who have been with me for years know that I always make these last-minute changes. Oh, well. But anyway, the general Parsha overview is that in these last 5 weeks of Moses' life, he's instructing the people of Israel. That's the generation that were children or not even born at the time we left Egypt. The children of Israel who left Egypt, the adults I should say, they're all dead except for 3. That is Moses, and he's about to die. He will never enter the land. And then you've got 2 others. One is Yehoshua, his name Joshua in the English, and then you've got Caleb. And these are 2 men that actually go into the promised land to lead the children of Israel. And as you remember from the book of Bamidbar, that is the book of Numbers, these were the only 2 spies that came back and gave a good report. The other 10 came back and gave an evil report, and the generation that was alive at the time believed these 10, and they did not enter into the rest of the promised land. So now what Moses is doing is instructing these children of Israel in that second generation, when they come into the land of Israel, to appoint Shoftim and officers in every city. And it goes as we read here, justice, justice, you must pursue. Verse number 20. That's repeated twice, and we're going to go over the reason why in a few minutes. He commands them, and you must administer it, that is justice, without corruption or favoritism. Bribes can turn ahead. Bribes can turn aside justice. Crimes then also must be meticulously investigated and evidence thoroughly examined with a minimum of 2 credible witnesses to convict and punish. In every generation, Moses says, there will be those entrusted with this task. We see that found within chapter 17. Every generation must appoint judges for the seats of this city to be able to do judging and ensuring justice to the people of that city. And according to the law they will teach you, the judgment they will instruct you, you shall do. You shall not turn away from the thing that they say to you to the right or to the left. This parsha includes the prohibitions against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointment and behavior of a king, what a king is to do. He's supposed to create 2 Torah scrolls when he comes into office as king. He's not to accumulate many horses for himself or many wives. But we can think of one king of Israel who did that. He accumulated many horses and many wives. That was King Solomon. And then also guidelines for the creation of cities of refuge. Now this is, the city of refuge is for an inadvertent killing of another human. It's not for intentional murder. Now the kinsman redeemer can chase, for the sake of a murder of their own kinsman, can chase the person who inadvertently killed that person. But once that person reaches a city of refuge, then that kinsman redeemer must not enter into it. Now the judges at the gate need to decide the case for that man who inadvertently killed to make sure he inadvertently killed. Now we have something similar in our legal system, and it's called manslaughter. And of course you have different degrees of killing a human being. Killing a human being is known as homicide. But there are different degrees. We know that some people do first-degree murder. Now that's killing somebody with motive and intent. Then you go down to second-degree murder. Well, there's less intent, but there is a motive. And then finally you get down to third-degree murder, which is not with an intent or particularly with a motive. Yet they could have that, like say somebody was going to rob, say somebody robbed John or had a gun at John's back and was intending on robbing him. He wasn't intending on killing John, except John made a quick movement and John ended up getting shot. Well, the guy who murdered him is going to be brought to justice, and somebody, the prosecutor, has to decide what charges are going to be leveled against that person. That's the job here, the Shoftim, the judges at the gate of the city. And if they determine that the person who has inadvertently killed did that, then that person is able to stay in that city until the death of the high priest. Once the high priest dies, then that person can leave, and the kinsman redeemer is not allowed to touch them. But we're not going to have time to go through that. Then there are also rules of war. Now this is interesting. Having been in the military for 8 years, and I know some of you have been in the military for a while, you know that there are certain exemptions. They call it, if you're classified as 4D, divinity student, I was once that. I went to Bible college. I didn't have to serve, even with the draft. I didn't have to serve during the Vietnam War. But I went into the Marine Corps anyway. Anyway, the thing is, here the rules of war are going to be a little different. Has nothing to do with flat feet or anything like that, but of course if you were crippled you wouldn't be good for battle anyway. The rules of the warfare, there was an exemption from battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or is afraid and soft-hearted. Now, being afraid and soft-hearted doesn't exactly exempt you from military today. But fortunately we have all volunteer military at this time. Then there are also requirements to offer terms of peace before attacking a city. There's a prohibition against wanton destruction of something of value, exemplified by the law that forbids the warrior to cut down a fruit tree when laying siege, and so forth. The Parsha ends with the law of the Eglah Arfa, the special procedure, to be followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer and his body is found in a field. They have to determine whose jurisdiction is this found in. And our law enforcement people do the same thing. They have to know whose jurisdiction this is under. So we kind of get a similar idea of what's going on here from our own legal system. The community has a responsibility, and its leaders, for what not only they do, but what they might have prevented from being done in their city. So that's the overview. Now we're going to start to put a magnifying glass on a topic, and that is going to be talking about the judges that are sitting in the gates of a city. We open up this Parsha by the words, "You shall appoint judges and officers for all your gates in the cities the Lord your God has given you, tribe by tribe, and they're to judge the people with righteous judgment." Now, in Tel Dan, Tel, by the way, just means a mound. And Dan means where this little city of Dan was built. And what would happen is this: in war or whatever, the city would be demolished and all its stones and so forth would be wiped out. And then another generation would come later and fill that up with sand or dirt and other stone and build another foundation on the foundation of the previous city. And then they'd have another city sitting there. And then when war or whatever destroyed that city, then again they would go ahead and rebuild the foundation. And so eventually you'd end up with a hill or a mound. Tel Megiddo. Tel means the mound of Megiddo. That's the city of Megiddo, where right now we know, if we hear the name Megiddo, we know that that's the area where Armageddon, Ar in the Hebrew, really it's Har, meaning mountain, Megiddo of Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo. But Tel Megiddo is the little town of Megiddo that was built on top of another city, which was built on top of another city, which was built on top of another city, which was built on top of another city. They just kept building cities on top of other cities. And so then you came out with a tel, or a mound, upon which this, by the way, has been excavated at Tel Dan. Now at Tel Dan, this was a gate of the city of Dan, right there, where the tribe of Dan was. And right there is a little seat where, by the way, you'll notice that there are stones down below where they could put a canopy, supporting stones that held wooden posts that held a canopy, where the judge or judges would sit underneath that canopy and judge cases that were coming to the gate. So this particular place is a place where the judge of the city would sit. And that's just giving you one example. Here's another example. If the person was more of a royal person, they would sit at the gate of the city. There's your gate, and there's where the throne was. So they'd have a throne sitting there where they can judge the people. Now you recall in the book of Samuel, where Absalom, the son of David, was being pursued by David, and he was excommunicated from the city for a time. And then he said, okay, I miss my son Absalom, so you can come back, Absalom. Well, what Absalom was trying to do was go ahead and take the kingdom away from his dad. So he would try to go ahead and judge the people that were coming to the gate before his dad would be able to get there, so that he can be a benefactor to the people. Now, it's really interesting. This is a common Middle East practice and was being done for centuries before we get to this Parsha in Deuteronomy. So long before Israel comes into the land of promise, we see several examples of it in Scripture. For instance, if you talk about Lot, the nephew of Abram, as he became known as Abraham, in Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. Now you remember when he first was given the choice to choose the land, Abraham said, you choose this land because their shepherds and all that were fighting against each other. Their people were fighting because Lot and Abraham had both large flocks and herds, and tents. So in Genesis chapter 13, Abraham, or Abram at that time, goes and says to Lot, you pick out this land that you want to go to, and I'll pick out the opposite land, and we're going to be okay if we separate one from the other. So what we see here is in Genesis 13:10, Lot looks up, sees that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the Garden of Adonai, which was like Eden, and like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. So Lot chose all the plain of the Jordan for himself, and Lot traveled eastward, and they separated themselves from each other. And Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain, setting his tent near Sodom. So the first thing you see when Lot chooses his land, he sets his tent near the city. And then, as we see at the time of the destruction of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, in Genesis 19:1, it says that the two angels came to Sodom at that evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. So what we see here is, what did Lot do? Well, he started out by moving his tent near the city of Sodom. I'm sure he knew that it was an evil place in the first place. And then, the next time we see Lot, where is he? He's sitting at the city gate. Who sits at the city gates? The judges. So we see this, that Lot is sitting in the gate, and when Lot offers refuge to these two angels by taking them into his house, the men of the city come and surround the house of Lot, and they said, where are the men, verse 5, if you're following with me, Genesis 19:5, where are the men who came to stay with you tonight? Bring them out to us. We want to have sex with them. And Lot went out to them and stood in the doorway, closing the door behind him, and said, please, my brothers, don't do such a wicked thing. Look here, I have two daughters who are virgins. Please let me bring them out to you, but you can do with them what seems good to you, but don't do anything to these men, since they're guests in my house. Now listen to the response from these evil men. Verse 9, stand back, they replied. This guy came to live here, and now he's decided to play what? Judge. So here is Lot, and I'm sure a man of well-renowned, and that's probably the reason why he got to be a judge. He had a lot of assets there. He had a lot of sheep, he had a lot of herds, he had a lot of servants, and he ends up moving from outside the city into the city itself. Now let's talk about sin for a while. I like to bring the message home to all of us. Isn't that like sin? Let's talk about the very first sin with Hava, Eve. All right? Here's the Garden of Eden. Who knows how many trees Adam and Eve were given permission to eat from? But there was one tree that God said, you shall not eat, or you shall die. Right? Just one. Well, I'm sure some time went by, and Eve goes walking by, and I'm sure Adam said, don't you dare touch that tree. And so Eve goes walking by, and you know what? She's saying, boy, that's a pretty tree, and the fruit is really nice looking. Well, you know, you could see it from afar at first. That's like sin. You see it coming from a distance. Now, we can't blame sin in what we do on Satan. Back in my generation, some of you probably have watched television before, and you remember the old joke that Flip Wilson used to give. That joke was, the devil made me do it. Well, listen, folks, we don't need any help from the devil. We're good enough about doing this ourselves. And we see this luxurious tree and the wonderful fruit there, and we say, aha! And we move a little closer. Well, nothing's happened yet. So we move a little bit closer. And I imagine that's what Lot did. And eventually, where are we? We're right smack dab in that city. What are we doing? Well, we're starting to buy into some of their precepts and concepts, which obviously you can tell by how Lot responded. So what we see here is Lot became a judge in that city, and that was being done long before, over 400 some years before the children of Israel enter into the land. Now, after we enter into the land, there's 2 Samuel 15. I talked about it a moment ago with Absalom. Absalom prepares himself a chariot and horses with 50 men, to run ahead of him. He'd get up early, he'd stand by the road leading to the city gate. Now, where did people go to get judged? At the city gate. So where did he head them off at the pass? Well, before they got there. Who's going to be there for judging the people? Well, King David would be. Or the Shoftim, or the judges. Well, Absalom would go ahead and ingratiate himself to these people that were coming for judgment. Now, back to Joshua chapter 20, verse 4. Here's the city of refuge where the inadvertent manslayer was to stand at the entrance to the city gate, state his cause to the city leaders. Then they're going to go ahead and judge him. If that man is not guilty of deliberate murder, then they'll bring him into the city with them, give him a place, and he may live among them. That's known as a city of refuge. Every tribe was to have one. Then you go into Ruth chapter 4. Ruth came into the land with her mother-in-law, Naomi, after her husband and 2 sons had died in the land of Moab. And so Ruth is the one that says, your people will be my people, your God my God, and she followed Naomi into the land. Now, she worked, she lived in this, Naomi's land was found in and near Bethlehem. And Boaz lived there. And Boaz goes ahead and sees that he is the kinsman redeemer to Naomi and to Ruth. He recognizes that there was another kinsman redeemer a little bit closer than he was that could have redeemed Ruth and Naomi. And so, since Boaz was interested in Ruth, he goes to the city gate and sits down there. Now, this means something about Boaz, folks. What was Boaz? He was a judge. You don't sit at the city gate unless you are a judge, see? We got a little insight about who Boaz was. He wasn't just a regular Jewish person. He was a heavyweight. He was a judge. And then when that next kinsman redeemer came by that gate, then he calls him over to the gate, invites him to sit down, and then he takes 10 of the city's leaders and say, sit down here, and they sat down. Well, he calls a quorum what is known as. A quorum is 10 righteous men. And so it's known as a minyan, M-I-N-Y-A-N, in Jewish circles. And he takes 10 of the city leaders, and he says to them, sit down here, and they sat down, and then they go ahead and judge the case on the merits, and they were witnesses that the nearest kinsman redeemer didn't want to buy Ruth and Naomi that plot of land because it would jeopardize his own inheritance. So he goes ahead and then says, you don't want it? Now these 10 are witnesses. And so that was all the way back then. Now we move up ahead now. We're in the land for some time, and then we have the prophet Amos comes by. Now in the Hebrew, the word for gates is sha'ar. And it occurs 3 times in the book of Amos. In chapter 5, verse 10, chapter 5, verse 12, and chapter 5, verse 15. And why I'm bringing this up is because in verse 15, that gate is explicitly called a place of justice. And that's exactly what our Parsha is talking about today. That the Shoftim were to be in Deuteronomy 16, verse 20, seeking only justice. That's it. So here at the Sha'ar, at the gates, that gate, or the gate of the city, is a place of justice. Now, gates of cities had many different functions. You could imagine one of the functions already. At the gate of the city, you go into and out of the city, right? What would you do in the city? Well, probably trade. What would you do out of the city? You'd probably be headed home. What would you do as you came to the gate? Well, if you had a case to be judged, you bring it before the judges. So there were a lot of different things that were done at the city gates. In fact, it was a main thing in those ancient times. Number one, it provided protection. It provided protection for the inhabitants. And when the city was surrounded by a wall, and Jerusalem was one of those cities, the gates were the only ways in or out of the city. Number 2, there's authority and glory of the city. In the Bible, a city gate represented the authority and the glory of the city. As examples, Isaiah 3:26 and Jeremiah 14, verse 2. Now in battle, to possess the gates of a city, it's a biblical expression meaning to possess the entire city. Once you possess the city, it's yours if you possess the gates. Genesis 22:17 and Genesis 24, verse 60. Now at the city's gates, that is where the civic centers of the city were. That's where the news was exchanged and discussed. It was a good common point. Genesis 19, verse 1, Genesis 23, verse 10, Genesis 34, verse 20. You can read these later. 2 Samuel 15, verse 2, Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 1, and then Psalm 69, 2, and verse 12. As we just saw with Absalom and King David at the city gates, kings had to meet with their subjects and even do judgment for them. We remember Solomon, when he went ahead and judged the 2 prostitutes that had brought the infant boy that was alive, and both of them said, "This is my son," but the son of one of the prostitutes had died, but both of them claimed the son that would have been likely to be at the city gates. And there Solomon would have been sitting on the throne and doing a judgment and saying, well, okay, each of you could get half. And the mother, the real mother, said no, she can have her, the other one. She'd rather have a live son who was raised by the wrong mother than a dead son that's not being raised at all. So here's where kings met with their subjects. 2 Samuel 19:8, 1 Kings 22:10, Jeremiah 38:7, 2 Chronicles 32:6. A lot of study material. Then at the city's gate, you could attract the attention of the sovereign or dignitary. Hey, hello! You know, like when the president goes by, everybody waves. But I won't. Sorry. Anyway, I don't know what side of politics you're on, but I won't. 2 Samuel 19:8, 1 Kings 22:10, Esther 2:29, Esther 29 and 21, and Esther 3:2. Then at the city gates, there was a reading of the law and the proclamations that took place, so everybody could hear it. Joshua 20, verse 4, 2 Chronicles 32:6, Nehemiah 8:1 and 3. At the city gates, the prophets and the priests delivered admonitions and pronouncements to the people. Isaiah 29:21, Amos 5:10, and Jeremiah 17:19. If I could only talk, I should be doing good. At the city's gates, strangers visiting the cities could pass the night if they had no place to stay. Remember Genesis 19:1 and 2? The 2 angels, when they came into the city, where were they expecting to spend the night? They're at the city gates. If you didn't have any other place to go, you could spend the night in the city gates. So there the judges, or the Shoftim, were at the city's gates and their responsibilities. The Israelites were instructed to establish authority with the judges at the city gates and as a place of judgment, to ensure justice and obedience to God's law by the people, as Deuteronomy 16:18 through 20 says. Now we're going to get into a play on words. Follow along with me. Look at Deuteronomy 16, verse 20. Now my translation says justice. Only justice you must pursue, so that you will live and inherit the land Adonai your God has given you. Now, does anyone have any other translation that says something else? Do you? Who has a King James? Nobody has a King James? Oh, wow. Everybody's got a complete Jewish Bible? Anybody got a New American Standard or any? I should have brought some of my other ones then. Yes, ma'am. What does yours say?
All the justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land and the Lord your God is giving you.
All right. Any other translations? Okay. Here's an interesting play on words. Now, the Hebrew does this. The Hebrew plays on words. Now, Hebrew is read right to left. So, here we got a tzadi, a daleth, and a kaf. Tzadi, daleth, kaf, and you got the tav, you got the resh, you got the daleth, and you got the fe, sofit. So you've got the words tzedek, tzedek. Tzedek, tzedek. Now, tzedek doesn't necessarily mean righteous. Justice, I'm sorry. It doesn't mean justice. Tzedek means righteous, righteous. So righteous, righteous, tirdof in the Hebrew. Righteous, righteous, tirdof. You can translate that as righteousness, righteousness. And it's really interesting that when you look through a rabbinical commentary, that it seems like most of the rabbis are kind of bothered by this redundancy. Why did he do this twice? Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Well, there was one rabbi that I found very interesting, Rabbi Eliyahu Meir, and he interpreted that the pursuit of righteousness, which is what this is saying, in verse 20 in the Complete Jewish Bible, justice, only justice you must pursue. So the pursuit of righteousness must also be pursued with righteousness. The pursuit of righteousness must also be pursued with righteousness. So how we go about pursuing righteousness or justice must be pursued by righteous or just means. Now, this isn't always the case in our justice system. You see, here's what the Bible is saying, that if you're a judge, you must pursue justice or righteousness with justice and righteousness. We're not merely to be taught to run after justice, we're told to be running after justice with justice. Now, we're going to hold the commentaries until after we have the oneg. This is something I want you to muse on for a little bit, to chew on, because I think this rabbi has answered the question. And many times we pursue that which is righteous and fair, we think. But our goal is to ensure, it should be, to ensure that what is right prevails. We're often tempted to let the ends justify the means. We may overlook the fact that we have to step on a few laws here and there as long as in the end the righteousness will prevail. That isn't how God said to pursue righteousness. You don't step on laws here or there to get to your end result. Your end result has to be obtained by pursuing righteousness for its sake. So the end does not justify the means. So then the question is, why does justice or tzedek get repeated twice? One, I believe, is to teach us that we need to pursue the goal of justice through means that are just, as the rabbi said. And then number two, to teach us that justice is for ourselves too, and justice is for others. It can't be just in our own interest, it has to be in the interest of all. Now, in our justice system, I watched the Fox News channel and I noticed the intense debate over the result of the George Zimmerman trial in Florida. And there are those who, like Jesse Jackson and some of the others, that were saying that that family, the Trayvon Martin family, did not receive justice. Well, the question is, did they receive justice or didn't they receive justice? Just because something came out in the minds of some that were not fair doesn't mean that justice wasn't pursued. Now, there were those that says, well, George Zimmerman shouldn't have been tried at all, that law enforcement initially went ahead and absolved them of any problem because of the stand your ground laws. And he wasn't even going to be brought to trial. Well, then the question is, why was he brought to trial? Well, because the Department of Justice under Holder pushed it down the hill and forced it to be brought to trial. Now, there are two good things about that, though, I should say. Number one is when they had the whole trial, if you watched it, you can see that it was what George Zimmerman did do by shooting Trayvon Martin was not racial. That was one. And the second thing is, it allowed the people who were watching to see, yes, indeed, they pursued all the aspects of what was occurring in that trial, what had actually happened. Now, just because the end result isn't fair doesn't mean that justice was not done. What I think Sharpton and Jackson and some of the other ones were trying to stir up was they were trying to say that the Trayvon Martin family didn't get revenge. Well, we read today, or Jamie did today, who is the only one that's to exact revenge? Who is it, Jamie? You read it. God himself. So, did justice get served? Yes. Was everybody happy with the end result? No. Now, here in our own law, outside of courtyards or in courthouses, oftentimes you will see Lady Justice with a scale balanced in her hand. She's covered with a blindfold over her eyes, and she has a sword in her other hand. Well, the scales are balanced, and it's supposed to be without partiality. And in our case that we see here in Genesis chapter 16, verse 19, it says, "You are not to distort justice or show favoritism, and you're not to accept a bribe, for a gift blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of even the upright." So money can subvert justice. And Lady Justice is supposed to execute justice on the scale balance of what is righteous. Righteous. That's why the word is repeated. Justice must be always impartial or blind. So justice must not, as we just read in Deuteronomy 16:19, must not show favoritism and must not blind the eyes of the wise or twist the words of the upright. So the job of the Shoftim, or the judges, was to protect the people from the outside world. So they sat at the gate, but they didn't protect in a military sense as the king would do. They protected in spiritual and moral ways, even as the king's army would go through the gate to protect the people physically. And then Deuteronomy 17:11, these judges were to judge according to the law. They were to teach the people the law, and the judgment that they will instruct, you will do. Now the question is, did Yeshua change all that? Well, we look in the New Testament, and the answer will be no. I want you to go to Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, Yeshua, our Lord, reaffirms the Torah, and not only just the Torah in, subject matter, content, but also every single letter of the Torah itself. He says in Matthew 17:19, "Don't think that I've come to abolish," and we talked about that earlier. That's a rabbinical term of argumentation. Abolish means to misinterpret, not to do away with the Torah or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, that means misinterpret again, but to complete, that means to interpret correctly. In fact, not until heaven and earth pass away, not even a yud or a stroke will pass away from the Torah until everything has already been accomplished. Whoever disobeys the least of the mitzvot, which means commandments, and teaches others to do so, would be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever obeys him and teaches others that will be great. So when Yeshua speaks about Torah, he's speaking about it enduring forever. Now go to Matthew chapter 23. Now Matthew chapter 23, Yeshua goes ahead in verse 1 and addresses the crowd and the Talmudim, the disciples, and said that the Torah teachers and the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. Whatever they tell you, take care to do it. But don't do what they do, because they talk but don't act. In other words, they're acting as hypocrites. But if they tell you to do something, take care to do it. Well, that goes along with our Parsha. When these priests, when these teachers teach Torah, you better listen to what they say and do it. Yeshua didn't change that. So here's what the seat of Moses was. In the synagogue of the day, and this I believe is Joe, I don't remember, is Robin here? Do you remember his name? The guy who was sitting in Chorazim? Yeah, that was Joe. Yeah, he got arrested for a moment there, but I'm not going to talk about that while we were on our tour. But there he is. All the synagogues of the day had this seat that a Shoftim, a judge, would sit in, or a Pharisee or Torah teacher, to be able to teach with authority the Torah and the prophets. Their custom at that time was to sit while they expounded the law and the prophets. You'll see that in Matthew 5:1 and Luke 4:20 through 22. Now, by meaning the seat of Moses, it meant they had the authority to teach the law. As Moses gave the law, so they had the authority to teach the law. And Yeshua is saying, what they say, do, but don't do as they do. Now, also in our Parsha, you're going to see in Deuteronomy chapter 17, where it says, if there's a case too difficult, verse 8, for you to judge at the city gates, then you will send it to the place where the Lord your God will choose. Well, ultimately, that place was Jerusalem. Now, the lowest court at the city gate is known as the Beit Din, or the house of judgment. If you go back to Matthew chapter 5 again, Yeshua talks about that. And in Matthew chapter 5, when he goes ahead and tells us that if you are, where you've heard the Torah says, thou shalt not murder, but if you are angry at your brother, you call him a fool, then you will be brought before the Beit Din, or the house of judgment. You'll see that in chapter 5, verse 22. I tell you, anyone who nurses anger against his brother will be subject to judgment, that whoever calls his brother you good for nothing will be brought to the Sanhedrin. So what we've got here is we've got the lowest court, which is at the city gate, the Beit Din, where you've got, the three rabbis as it eventually came to be. Then you got the highest court, the Sanhedrin, which is the national court, which we can equate with the Supreme Court. And if a case comes before you that is too difficult for you to judge concerning bloodshed, civil suit, personal injury, any other controversial issue, you go to that place, Hamakom in the Hebrew, the place which the Lord your God will choose. As I said, ultimately Jerusalem. There you will seek the judge in office, and they will render a verdict for you. And then you will act according to what they have told you there in that place which the Lord will choose. Now let's briefly talk about the death sentence. Deuteronomy 16:6. Here we're even concerning bloodshed to the Supreme Court. Deuteronomy 16:6, the death sentence is to be carried out only if there was a testimony from 2 or 3 witnesses. A person may not be sentenced to death on the testimony of only one. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 7, the witnesses are to be the first to stone him to death. If they're condemned to death by the house of judgment, then the witnesses are to be the first to stone them. Afterward, all the people are to stone them. Thus you shall put an end to the wickedness among you. Now, the next question I ask you in the New Testament, because this comes up a lot, was Yeshua Jesus against the death penalty? The classic example is brought up in the Gospel of John chapter 8. So if you turn with me to John chapter 8, verse number 1, it says, Yeshua went to the Mount of Olives. At daybreak he appeared again in the temple court where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. Well, how did rabbis or teachers teach at the time? They what? Sat down. Now you understand, why did he sit down? Because he was a Torah teacher. Then the Torah teachers and the Pharisees bring in a woman who had been caught committing adultery, made her stand in the center of the group. Now, we sang some songs today, and if you didn't catch the theme, the songs dealt with the Messiah and with judgment. He will not judge with the sight of his eyes, with the sight of his eyes or the hearing of his ears, but he will judge with what? He will judge with righteous judgment. Isaiah 11, verse number 1. He will not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but he will judge the impoverished justly. He will decide fairly for the humble of the land. Justice will be the belt around his waist, faithfulness the sash around his hips. So it was expected by the time of the Messiah, when he did come, that Messiah was going to judge righteously. He's going to come from the tribe of Jesse. He will grow from the roots of Jesse through David and following along, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. Luke chapter 4. And he will judge justly. Well, the Torah teachers knew all this. They knew that the Messiah was going to come and do this. So what they wanted to do is to expose him as a false Messiah, because there had been more false messiahs at the time. So they asked him a she'elah, meaning to ask in the Hebrew, meaning to ask a question specifically about Scripture. What they wanted to do, as John 8 says, is they wanted to trap Yeshua with his own words and prove that he wasn't the Messiah and that he didn't justly judge. So it says in John 8:4, they said to him, "Rabbi, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery." Now in our Torah, Moses commanded that such a woman be stoned to death. Now, is that true? That a woman caught in the very act of adultery be stoned to death? The answer is yes, that is true. But that isn't all the truth. You know, when we give an oath, you know, if we have to give testimony in court, I swear to tell the truth, the what? Whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If it's anything less than the whole truth, is it the truth? No. It may be part of the truth. But this woman was caught in the very act. I believe that. And it does say to stone the people caught in adultery. What do you say about it? Now remember, they only brought the one. They said this to trap him. Remember, they're trying to trap him. So they only brought the one, and it was very deliberate, so that they may have ground for bringing charges against him. He just bends down, begins writing in the dust with his finger, but they keep on pestering him and asking him the question. So he straightens up and says to them, "The one of you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Now we just talked about that. Who's going to be the first to bring the throwing of the stones? Is she guilty? Yes, she was caught in the very act. So who's going to be the first to bring the stone throwing? The witnesses. So what does he say to them? Okay, the one of you without sin, let him be the first to throw it at her, the stones. So now Yeshua shifts the burden back to them. Now follow me with this. They brought her to him for judgment for adultery. Now he goes and shifts the burden back to them by saying, okay, if you're without sin, cast the first stone. Now, did they have the opportunity? Yes, perfectly opportunity. The witnesses were supposed to throw the stones at her first. Once again, reminding you, Deuteronomy 17:7. The witnesses are to be the first to stone them to death, then the people. So, Yeshua is following the Torah perfectly. Perfectly. He's not abolishing, misinterpreting the Torah. He's completing or fulfilling it, interpreting it correctly. So he says, the one of you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. That was what the Torah said. So what's next? Well, you read the story in John 8. It goes on to say, verse 8, he bends down and writes in the dust again. What he wrote, up to speculation. Some Torah teachers, some Christians and all say, well, he's writing down all their sins. No, he doesn't even have to do that. Because if they knew what Torah was saying, they knew they already sinned by just bringing the woman. Beginning with the oldest, and usually we older ones are supposed to be the wiser ones. Beginning with the oldest, they left one by one. And then the younger ones. Then it was just Yeshua and the woman. Well, the witnesses left without stoning her. Why? Well, because they violated the Torah in bringing her alone to Yeshua for judgment. They violated the Torah. All of them. Both the man and the woman were caught in adultery. You can't be caught in adultery all by yourself. The Torah says both. In Leviticus 20:10, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Well, let's give you a second witness. Deuteronomy 22:22. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. Now, since of course the woman and the man obviously had to be caught together committing adultery, the obvious question to ask is, where's the man? Well, they let him go. And they knew what they were doing because they deliberately let him go so they could bring the woman alone. You see the trap that he could have been in? Yeshua could have been in a trap if he just said simply, yeah, stone her. Because then he would have been violating Torah, because Torah says what? That and what? That, both. You see? So, if he is the Messiah, and he is, then he is not allowed to violate his own Torah.